Hi, everybody. I'm Michael James. I'm the host of the Live from the Heartland show. And our second guest for the week of March 14th is the Professor Euan Hague, the director of the School of Public Service at DePaul University. And we talk about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how it impacts DePaul University and beyond. I think you'll enjoy.
Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit.
Okay, all you citizens of the world, it's time for the second segment of Live from the Heartland for the week of March 14th. We are recording it a couple days early, and our next guest is someone who we've had on the show a few times, and I've been honored to teach a class with him for the last 10 years at DePaul University, so I've gotten to see him a lot. And I think that you all will enjoy our next guest, the one and only Euan Hague, professor of geography and the director of the School of Public Service at the great University of DePaul. Hello to you, Euan. It's always good to see you.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, last time we got together, because we both lived pretty close to each other, you had been you and a lot of other people at DePaul had received a letter from somebody named Craig Trainer, the acting assistant secretary for Civil Rights, Department of Education. It was actually on Valentine's Day. Now, what was that letter all about? Because we want to talk about DEI, we want to talk about. So
Right.
What do you have in that letter that made everybody a little bit nuts?
Well, this wasn't a letter directly to us as faculty, but it was written by the Trump administration, and it's kind of circulated through higher education. So it wasn't specifically to DePaul or to me personally, but it's a letter that we were all talking about. It kind of came out on the evening of Valentine's Day. So the next Monday morning, because Valentine's Day, if you remember, was a Friday, the next Monday morning, this was all the discussion on campus. And this is one of the many, it's not obviously, it's one of the many things that the Trump administration has done to really put, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in its crosshairs. I'll just read a little bit of the letter. Federal law thus prohibits covered entities from using race in decisions pertaining to admissions, hiring, promotion, compensation, financial aid, scholarships, prizes, administrative support, discipline, housing, graduation ceremonies, and all other aspects of student, academic, and campus life. Put simply, educational institutions may neither separate or segregate students based on race, nor distribute benefits or burdens based on race. And so that's the language that was in this letter that came out of the Department of Education. And the threat continued. The department intends to take appropriate measures to assess compliance with the applicable statutes and regulations based on the understanding embodied in this letter, beginning no later than 14 days from today's date, including anti-discrimination requirements that are conditioned of receiving federal funding. So the threat really in this letter from the Trump administration was to cut off federal funding for academic institutions if race is taken into account in any of that list of things. And so this letter generated on our campus at DePaul University more questions than answers. And I think it was, people were like, does my course in African studies fall under this letter? Does our Black Student Association fall under this letter? We have at DePaul University, we have cultural resource room. So we have a room which is designated as cultural resources, for example, for the Latino students or the LGBTQ students. Do they fall under this letter? What about a scholarship that is particularly for a Hispanic student body or something like that? So there was this raised a lot of questions, and I don't know what our administration has done. We did have, soon after this letter was made public, and again, this went round all academic institutions in the United States, not just DePaul. So we're all kind of, whether it's us or University of Chicago or Northwestern or, Iowa or Michigan or wherever, we're all kind of acting under these auspices now. And so the big question is really what is going to happen. And I think on campus, we invited two of our distinguished alums back onto our campus, Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul and also Lieutenant Governor Stratton. And both of them made it very clear that the state of Illinois is looking into some of these and all the other announcements coming out of the White House, and they're determined to keep Illinois a diverse, welcoming, inclusive state. And they were very strongly supportive of the work that we do at DePaul, and that the institution is committed to treating all people with dignity and respect, as befits our namesake, St. Vincent de Paul.
Well, diversity, equity, and inclusion is what DEI is all about. And I'm Katie Hogan, who is one of the producers of the show and comes on pretty regularly, turned me on to some information yesterday where the Department of Defense is cleaning up their website, and they are removing 26,000 pictures of people of color and women. And that's been going on everywhere. I mean, they're going after a lot of stuff. How is I know that the faculty's probably been pretty good at DePaul and would love to see Illinois really stand up to this. What's your sense of the administration at DePaul? Are they standing tall, or maybe not quite? And can you talk about that or not?
I think the administration so far is almost as in the dark as a lot of the faculty and staff and students. But there's a sense that at DePaul, we had presentations from our Office of the Mission and Mission and Values. We're a Catholic Vincentian institution, and St. Vincent de Paul himself, back in France hundreds of years ago, was ministering to the poor and the indigent, and and giving out alms and resources to the very poorest people in society, when that kind of thing was frowned upon and was even in some instances illegal. And so that kind of service to communities around the city is baked into our institution's very identity and its very mission. So I was joking to a colleague of mine, we're getting these letters from Trump, the Trump administration, and we have St. Vincent de Paul is setting our agenda. And the question is, what is the higher calling? I like to sort of go with St. Vincent de Paul on that one. So I think we're having a lot of meetings. We're having a lot of Know Your Right sessions. We're discussing having a film series about how do we understand the present moment in the United States. I've heard from friends and colleagues who have seen their federal grants frozen, for example. I was talking to a colleague who was working with to improve health access in some of Chicago's most underserved and poorest neighborhoods, and their federal funding was suspended. And I think a lot of people have questions about if this is going to hit us, when it's going to hit us, how it's going to hit us.
I would be curious to know about where the Catholic Church is on all things. I mean, we know that the Pope has been a pretty progressive person, and we also know that there are people who don't like the Pope so much and are in the church. And we have a couple of universities, well, a number of them around Chicagoland that are Catholic, including DePaul and Loyola. And I'm just wondering, are there I just kind of wonder where the church is at on things, and if you have any indication of, even though DePaul may be standing up, how other Catholic groups might be responding to all of this.
I don't know how the church is responding. Obviously, there was, just I know from the news that there was a statement from Pope Francis that challenged some of J.D. Vance's interpretations of theology recently. But some of the most prominent pushback so far has been from Georgetown Law School. Obviously, Georgetown is a Jesuit Catholic institution, and their dean of the law school had a letter pushing back because they had been told by the Trump administration that no Georgetown law student no graduate of Georgetown Law School would be employed by the federal government while Georgetown still has DEI on its curriculum and works with recognition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I encourage people to Google and look up that letter from the dean of Georgetown Law School, which was a very forceful pushback against the Trump administration and a strong statement of commitment to the values of Catholic education. So I think, there's a tradition in Catholic education of recognizing the dignity of every individual, working with individuals as a sort of what we would call at DePaul servant leadership. And I think that is very strong. And I do know that many of our president here at DePaul University, President Manuel, has told us that many of the Catholic universities around the United States their leadership are talking with each other about how to handle this current moment. I mean, technically, we are a religious nonprofit, and one of the arguments is that the speech of the university is the free speech of a religious institution, and therefore, if the university chooses to engage in practices and policies that can be anything, such as a scholarship for excellence in African American studies, does that fall under this type of letter? And so I think people they have questions, but the sentiment I get is a lot of people are committed to what we have been doing at DePaul throughout my career here, 20 or so years, and will continue to do that.
Euan Hague, what do you have any sense of other universities in Chicago and Chicagoland, like Northwestern and Illinois Wesleyan got called out by the government over DEI questions? We know that there were demonstrations at the University of Chicago, and actually this week, because we've had a student at Columbia, a recent graduate at Columbia University in New York, got picked up by ICE. He's now in Louisiana. He has a wife who's an American citizen. There's a baby on the way. All he did was participate in a demonstration, and he has rights of free speech. But people are reacting to that. And up at Northwestern, there's been some criticism of the president there, who is Jewish, I believe, over the Trump administration saying they aren't doing enough to fight anti-Semitism on the campus. I'm not sure about other schools. I'm not sure what Loyola's doing. What message does it send that Trump administration has cut off $400 million from Columbia University and arrested a recent graduate of Columbia over participating in a demonstration?
I mean, this is obviously very concerning. The fact that pretty much all universities, all higher education in the United States relies on federal money, even if it's just something like student loans. Technically, that is federally funded student loans. And I know the administration has claimed that they're not going to target individuals, but obviously the example you've given is that of an individual. The other thing people are worried about is research grants, National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation. I have a colleague here at DePaul who just completed a project that was funded by NASA using satellite data to look at sort of environmental impacts. And there's a sort of concern about, a lot of these funds being cut off will really really put really constrain what a university can do, and what we can do as faculty and professionals. Obviously, the arrest of this individual, I don't know the full details, but it sends a chilling message that a legal permanent resident in the United States can be arrested for their protest. We obviously at DePaul, as many people know, had a situation with a encampment about a year ago on our campus that was a response to the situation in Israel, Gaza. And so there are concerns about these things, and there are concerns about academic freedom, the freedom to teach and say what you want to on campus, the ability of free inquiry, all these things. We're discussing these in a way that I think that we probably haven't discussed them for a decade. And I think it's really important that we as an institution, as faculty, staff, and students have a strong sense of our commitment to each other and our institution, and to academic freedom, and to what that means.
You're from Scotland, and you get to visit back home every once in a while, as well as take students to Europe. You're a well-traveled person. You're on top of a lot of things. I'm wondering if you can share anything you're hearing from your homeland, and what the response of people in Scotland and Europe in general might be.
So one of the things from talking with family and friends in Scotland and the UK, they get the headlines. They get all the headlines. They get the Trump headlines. They obviously saw the Trump-Zelensky Ukraine incident in the Oval Office last week, and they're getting all the headlines. And I think one of the things that they don't necessarily get is the nuance of some state-by-state reactions. So you'll get the headline, Trump is doing this, or the U.S. is doing this, but they don't necessarily know that 19 states have brought a lawsuit against that. They don't necessarily know that 20 states have refused to follow that direction. You don't get that kind of federalism isn't really communicated necessarily well. For example, there'll be the headlines about Trump cracking down on immigration, but then if we look at what happened recently, our Mayor Brandon Johnson and mayors of other cities were in Capitol Hill explaining their reaction to the immigration efforts from the federal government. And so quite often the kind of city by city, state by state reaction doesn't get as much coverage. And so I think there's maybe less recognition of how things are actually playing out on the ground than the headline level. The headline level is what carries the story in the UK. And normally it's kind of like, I said, for example, I sent the Dear Colleague letter we started the show discussing. I sent it to my father, and he says, well, wait a minute, does this mean you can't discuss slavery? Which is kind of that was his reaction to this letter when he read it through. Is like, well, that would mean that is off the table, I get. And it's just, so I think it's that kind of level of detail. They wouldn't necessarily, unless you follow American politics really in detail, you wouldn't necessarily see all these executive orders or this letter or this statement to this audience. So I think they get the big headlines, but the drill down is maybe not, because they have other issues. And I think one of the things that we've seen this last week, of course, is Europe's commitment to Ukraine and the sort of efforts from President Macron, Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom and elsewhere. How are we going to react to a world where the United States is no longer the number one ally of Western Europe? And I think that's really interesting. You mentioned I travel with students. I take students every year to Brussels in Belgium, where we go to meet with representatives of the European Union and NATO. We go to NATO's big headquarters on the outskirts of Brussels. And last year, March of 2024, we went and we met with the American representative. There was a lot of discussion of America's policies towards Ukraine, a lot of discussion about Russian disinformation and, America's commitment to NATO and building a stronger alliance. I'm due to go to NATO again in 2 weeks' time, I hope. And it'd be really interesting to see how and if the presentation that we share with students has changed. So I think that's one of the things. And so I'm talking right now with my students in my class about shifting alliances, the role of NATO, the United States seeming to be less committed to NATO. One of the things we talked about a lot recently, of course, is Trump's supposed plan to acquire Greenland, but Greenland is connected to Denmark, and Denmark is part of NATO. So Greenland is part of NATO already. There's American bases on Greenland, and it's sort of the question is, what is the commitments to these global alliances, which makes for a hard lecture to write because they seem to be changing day by day, but for a good classroom discussion. I think it's a good question as well. You mentioned my previous work on neo-Confederates or pro-Confederate activism. I actually wrote a piece.
That was my next question was that you had a great book when we first met called the Neo-Confederacy. And it was about an organization that's actually based in Rockford, Illinois. And why don't you talk a little bit about that? Because we have seen the rise of the right, and we knew that there were white supremacists, and we knew that there were latent fascists. We didn't quite know that we would see the situation turn out the way it has, with Trump being in the White House again and pushing really pretty right-wing policies. Why don't you talk a little bit about that book and where that leads us?
Yeah, so that book was published in 2008, and the organizations were not based in Rockford, Illinois, but there was a magazine that came out of Rockford, Illinois called Chronicles, where a lot of these right-wing thinkers had pieces about contemporary politics. I think the through line is really interesting. So firstly, in 2017, I think for the 10 years after the book was published, I wrote a piece called, when Trump was first elected, I wrote a piece called Making America Confederate Again, which was very much what Trump was what I thought Trump was doing at the time. And a lot of the ideas that kind of have come into contemporary Trumpism, I first read about on these right-wing pro-Confederate websites in the 1990s. I think a second thing that's really interesting, and I encourage your listeners to go and find these connections themselves, and I think they were recently detailed in media like USA Today, but the new defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, is affiliated with the religious movement led by a guy called Doug Wilson out of Moscow, Idaho. And Doug Wilson previously was very much involved. He wrote a book called Southern Slavery as It Was, which was kind of an apology for slavery and was very much part of the pro-Confederate literature that came about in the 1990s. So I don't know if you want to play 76 degrees of separation, but there's certainly voices in this administration that are familiar with the arguments about race, ethnicity, gender, religion, and so forth that were made by those kind of pro-Confederate, very, very fringe organizations in the 1990s. And now, 30 years later, they're connected in to the very highest echelons of power in the United States.
Let's go back to campus. And one of the things I always like about DePaul and teaching there is it's a real diverse community. We have people from around the world, people of all different nationalities, religions. And I wonder, I know that the DEI can't be used any longer in admissions, that kind of thing. How does that affect us at DePaul and other universities around that you may know of?
Oh, I don't deal directly with admissions. We just obviously see the incoming class as students, but I think Chicago as a diverse area is a place where we're going to get a diversity of students, and I think our university remains committed to representing society as a whole. And that's what I believe our admissions team works to bring in a representative of our whole Chicagoland area into the incoming class. So once the students are there, it's great to see them in our classrooms, and we have some really good, as you know, some really good conversations about these issues and the times that we're facing.
Well, we'll be talking more, Euan. It's always a great pleasure to have you on the show. It's always a good pleasure to see you in the neighborhood. I've really enjoyed teaching with you, and I want to thank you for coming on.